Someone once told the most feared mafia boss in the city that he was a monster who felt nothing. But the night a small boy stood in front of his mother and said, "My mom doesn't need you," that same mafia boss felt something crack open inside him, because for a single, impossible moment, he wasn't looking at a stranger's child. He was staring at himself at 5 years old, standing in the same stubborn, protective way he had once stood beside his own mother before the streets, the violence, and the empire swallowed his life whole. It started on a cold Tuesday evening in a small grocery store on the edge of a neighborhood most wealthy people avoided. The kind of place where the fluorescent lights hummed softly and the shelves were never completely full because customers here bought only what they absolutely needed. Elena Ruiz stood at the checkout counter with one hand gripping the handle of a worn shopping basket and the other digging through her purse for loose coins, her dark hair falling forward as she counted the money again for the third time, hoping the numbers would somehow change if she looked hard enough. They didn't. $8 short. The cashier, a tired man who had clearly had a long day, tapped the counter with his pen and sighed quietly while scanning the small pile of groceries Elena had chosen carefully: bread, eggs, milk, and a small bag of rice. Behind Elena stood a little boy no older than 5 with big brown eyes and a jacket that was slightly too thin for the chilly weather outside. Mateo Ruiz didn't complain, didn't fidget, didn't beg for candy like other kids sometimes did. Instead, he simply held onto the back of his mother's coat with small, determined fingers, watching the cashier with the serious expression of a child who already understood more about the world than he should. "I'm sorry," Elena said softly, her voice tight with embarrassment as she pushed the rice aside. "We'll leave that." The cashier shrugged and began adjusting the total when another voice spoke calmly from behind them. "That won't be necessary." The entire line seemed to pause as a tall man in a dark charcoal coat stepped forward, placing a crisp bill on the counter as casually as someone paying for a cup of coffee. The air in the store shifted instantly, the way it sometimes does when a storm is about to break. Because people in this city recognized that man, even if they pretended they didn't. His name was Lorenzo DeMarco. Some called him a businessman. Others called him something much darker. But everyone knew the rumors, the quiet power, the men who followed him, the way problems disappeared when he decided they should. The cashier froze for half a second before quickly accepting the money and finishing the transaction without another word. Elena turned around slowly, confusion flashing across her face before it hardened into something sharper. "Pride." "No," she said immediately, pushing the groceries back toward the cashier. Lorenzo tilted his head slightly, as if he hadn't heard correctly. People usually didn't say no to him. "It's nothing," he said calmly. "Just take the groceries." Elena's eyes narrowed, and Mateo instinctively stepped a little closer to her side. "I said no." Several customers nearby suddenly became very interested in the snack aisle, pretending not to listen. Because refusing Lorenzo DeMarco wasn't just unusual, it was dangerous. But Elena didn't seem to care. She lifted the small bag of groceries and took Mateo's hand firmly. "My son doesn't need you," she said clearly, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet store. The words landed like a slap in the silence. A couple near the door stared in disbelief. The cashier looked down at the counter as if praying the moment would pass quickly. Lorenzo didn't move. For a long second, he simply looked at the boy. Mateo met his gaze without fear, standing straight even though he barely reached Lorenzo's waist. There was something in the way the child stood, shoulders squared, shins slightly lifted, body angled protectively toward his mother, that made Lorenzo's breath catch in his chest. Because he had seen that stance before. In a cracked mirror above a kitchen sink 30 years ago. In a small apartment that smelled like cheap soup and cigarette smoke. In the reflection of a skinny 5-year-old boy standing in front of his mother while an angry landlord shouted threats from the hallway. The memory hit Lorenzo so suddenly it almost felt physical. The thin shoes. The stubborn pride. The silent promise a child makes when he decides he will protect his mother even if the world is bigger and stronger than he is. Mateo Ruiz looked exactly like that boy had looked. Exactly like Lorenzo DeMarco had looked at 5 years old before he learned that protecting someone in this world sometimes meant becoming the very thing people feared. Elena tugged gently on Mateo's hand and began walking toward the door, unaware of the storm of memories she had just awakened inside one of the most powerful men in the city. The automatic doors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. letting in a gust of cold air and the distant sound of traffic. Matteo glanced back once, curiosity flickering across his face as Lorenzo still stood frozen beside the counter. Outside, the sky was darkening, heavy clouds rolling over the city like slow waves. Elena pulled Matteo's hood up and hurried them toward the sidewalk. Inside the store, Lorenzo remained still for several seconds longer while his driver, a large man in a tailored suit waiting near the entrance, watched him carefully. "Boss?" the man asked quietly. Lorenzo finally blinked, the present rushing back around him. He reached into his coat pocket and placed another bill on the counter without looking at it. For the rest of the store, he said absent-mindedly before turning toward the door. But his mind wasn't on the money or the curious stares following him. It was on the small boy walking down the sidewalk outside, holding his mother's hand like he was already responsible for the entire world. Because Lorenzo DeMarco had built an empire by trusting no one and caring about nothing. Yet for the first time in 20 years, something inside him had recognized a piece of his own forgotten past. And that was far more dangerous than any enemy. The rain began just as Elena Ruiz and her son Matteo stepped out of the grocery store, a cold drizzle that quickly soaked the sidewalks and turned the streetlights into blurry halos in the dark evening air. Elena pulled Matteo closer as they hurried down the block, the small bag of groceries swinging from her hand while she tried to ignore the strange feeling that someone was still watching them. Matteo's sneakers splashed through shallow puddles as he walked beside her, unusually quiet for a 5-year-old, until he finally looked up and asked the question he had been holding in since they left the store. "Mom, who was that man?" Elena hesitated before answering. "Just someone who wanted to help." Matteo frowned slightly. "But you didn't let him." Elena stopped under a flickering street lamp and crouched down so she could look him in the eye. Rain tapped softly against her jacket as she spoke. "Sometimes people offer help because they expect something later. And when you accept it, you owe them. I don't want anyone thinking we owe them anything. Understand?" Matteo nodded slowly, though the idea was clearly bigger than he could fully understand. "But he didn't look mean," the boy said quietly. Elena brushed a raindrop from his cheek and forced a small smile. "Mean people don't always look mean." Just then, the low rumble of an engine rolled up beside them, and Elena stiffened instantly as a sleek black car stopped at the curb. The back window lowered slowly, revealing Lorenzo DeMarco sitting calmly inside, the dim light of the car outlining his serious expression while rain streaked down the glass. For a few seconds no one spoke. Elena tightened her grip on Matteo's hand. "You'll both get sick walking in this weather," Lorenzo finally said. His voice was calm, almost casual. "We're fine," Elena replied immediately. Lorenzo studied her for a moment before glancing down at the boy beside her. Matteo stared back with open curiosity. "You have a nice car," the boy said suddenly. The corner of Lorenzo's mouth almost lifted. "Thank you." Elena gave Matteo a quick look but didn't scold him. Lorenzo leaned slightly forward in his seat. "I can drive you home," he offered. "It's not charity." Elena shook her head. "No." The rain grew heavier, soaking the shoulders of her coat, but she didn't move closer to the car. Lorenzo's attention returned to the boy. "What's your name?" he asked. "Matteo," the child answered. "Matteo Ruiz." Lorenzo nodded slowly. "That's a strong name." Matteo seemed pleased. "My dad picked it," he said. Elena's expression tightened slightly, and Lorenzo noticed the change immediately. "Your father has good taste," he said carefully. Matteo shrugged in the honest way children sometimes do when speaking about things adults struggle with. He left, the word hum in the rainy air. Elena looked down at the pavement, clearly uncomfortable, but Lorenzo didn't ask any more questions. He didn't need to. The story was familiar. Too familiar. For a moment, he saw flashes of his own childhood. His tired mother working long hours, the empty chair at the kitchen table, the promises that never came back through the door. Lorenzo exhaled quietly and looked at Elena again. "You don't trust me," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she answered honestly. Lorenzo nodded once, almost approvingly. "Good." That response surprised her. Most powerful men expected obedience, not suspicion. Lorenzo rested his arm on the door frame. "But I wasn't lying earlier," he added. "The groceries weren't a favor." Elena frowned slightly. "Then what were they?" Lorenzo looked at Matteo again before answering. "A memory." The answer clearly confused her. Matteo tilted his head. "What kind of memory?" Lorenzo hesitated for a moment, something unusual for a man used to having all the answers. The kind that reminds you who you used to be. The rain kept falling between them, filling the silence. Elena studied him carefully, trying to understand why a man with his reputation would bother stopping for them at all. Finally, Lorenzo opened the car door and stepped out into the rain, ignoring the water quickly soaking his coat. Elena instinctively took a small step back. Lorenzo looked down at Matteo once more. The boy stood straight beside his mother, shoulders squared like he was already trying to protect her from the world. Lorenzo recognized that posture immediately. He had stood the same way once. "Take the ride," Lorenzo said quietly. "Not because you need help." His voice softened slightly. "Because sometimes a stranger remembers what it feels like to be that kid." Matteo looked up at his mother hopefully while the rain continued to fall around them, and Elena hesitated, unsure whether the moment in front of her was dangerous or simply the beginning of something neither of them expected. 3 days passed before Elena Ruiz saw the black car again, and by then she had almost convinced herself the strange encounter with Lorenzo DeMarco had been nothing more than a moment that would fade away like rain on the pavement. Life quickly returned to its normal rhythm. Long shifts at the diner, late nights helping Matteo with his reading, and a constant worry about bills that never seemed to stop arriving. But something in the neighborhood had quietly changed. The broken streetlight outside their apartment building, which had flickered for months, was suddenly fixed. The landlord who had been threatening eviction showed up one morning strangely polite, mumbling about a misunderstanding before lowering the rent slightly. Even the group of troublemakers who usually hung around the corner seemed to disappear overnight. Elena noticed all of it, and deep down she already suspected why. Then one evening as the sun dipped low over the rooftops, Matteo was playing with a small toy car on the cracked sidewalk outside their building when the familiar black sedan rolled slowly to the curb. Elena stepped outside immediately, her arms folding across her chest as Lorenzo DeMarco stepped out of the car. He looked exactly the same as before, calm, controlled, impossible to read. Matteo's face lit up with excitement. "It's the car man," the boy shouted happily. Elena shot him a look before turning back to Lorenzo. "I told you we don't need help," she said firmly. Lorenzo nodded once. "I remember." She gestured toward the streetlight and the building behind her. "Then what is all this?" For a moment Lorenzo didn't answer. Instead he looked down at Matteo, who was now pushing the toy car across the sidewalk with full concentration. Finally he spoke quietly. "Protection." Elena frowned. "We didn't ask for that." Lorenzo's eyes softened just slightly as he watched the boy. "I know." Matteo looked up suddenly. "Are you a good guy?" he asked with the blunt honesty only a child could have. The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Lorenzo thought about the things he had done, the empire he had built, and the fear his name carried across the city. For years the answer would have been easy, but looking at Matteo standing there, small but fearless beside his mother, something felt different. Finally Lorenzo answered truthfully. "I'm trying to be." Matteo seemed satisfied with that answer and returned to playing. Elena studied Lorenzo carefully. "Why us?" she asked. Lorenzo's gaze drifted back to the boy again. "Because when I looked at him in that store," he said quietly, "I saw the kid I used to be." Elena didn't speak, unsure how to respond. Lorenzo turned toward his car, clearly ready to leave. But before getting inside he paused and said one last thing without looking back. "You don't owe me anything. No favors. No debts." He nodded toward Matteo. "Just make sure he stays the kind of kid who stands up for his mother." Then he stepped into the car, the door closing softly as the engine started. Matteo waved enthusiastically as the black sedan pulled away and disappeared down the street. Elena watched it until the taillights vanished completely, realizing something strange and powerful had happened. The most feared man in the city hadn't helped them because he wanted control, money, or loyalty. He had done it because a small boy had reminded him of the person he used to be before the world changed him. And for the first time in a long time, Lorenzo DeMarco had remembered what it felt like to protect someone, instead of being the one everyone feared.